The origins of America's greatest internal conflict can be traced back to the earliest foundations of European settlement in the New World. Long before the United States existed as a nation, before its constitution or its ideals of liberty became guiding principles, there was a system taking root that would cast a long shadow over its future. That system was slavery. By the early 17th century, ships carrying enslaved Africans began arriving in the English colonies along the Atlantic coast. These men, women, and children were stripped from their homelands, transported across the Atlantic under brutal conditions, and forced into labor that would enrich the colonies while denying them the most basic elements of humanity. In 1619, the arrival of a group of Africans in Virginia marked a symbolic beginning of a practice that would expand dramatically in the centuries that followed. Though slavery existed in various forms around the world, the version that emerged in the American colonies quickly became a rigid, racialized institution. Laws were enacted to ensure that enslaved Africans and their descendants would be considered property, something to be bought, sold, punished, and exploited at the will of their owners. This transformation was deliberate, crafted to secure labor for a growing economic system that depended on physical toil and agricultural productivity. It was in the southern colonies, with their fertile soil and warm climate, that slavery would take its deepest hold. The economy of the South evolved around plantation agriculture, first tobacco, later cotton and sugar. As growing demand in both American and European markets created enormous financial opportunities. Tobacco fueled the early economy of Virginia and Maryland, while rice and indigo became staples in the Carolinas. However, it was the cotton boom of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, driven by the invention of the cotton gin, that magnified the South's dependence on enslaved labor beyond anything previously imagined. Cotton became the lifeblood of the Southern economy, and enslaved people were seen not merely as workers but as the very foundation of a vast agricultural empire. As the Southern economy grew wealthier, it also grew morally and structurally distinct from the North. While Southern states remained deeply tied to agricultural production, the Northern states embarked on a different trajectory entirely. The Industrial Revolution swept across the North, bringing factories, railroads, and wage-based labor systems. Northern cities expanded rapidly, commerce flourished, and new immigrant populations fueled industrial development. Although racism and discrimination were far from absent in the North, its economy no longer relied on slavery, and many Northern citizens began to view the institution with increasing discomfort or outright moral opposition. This divergence created not only economic differences, but also profound cultural and philosophical divides. In the North, a growing number of religious groups, intellectuals, and political activists began to speak out against slavery. The abolitionist movement gained momentum as figures like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, and Harriet Beecher Stowe exposed the cruelties of the system and called for its immediate end. Abolitionist newspapers circulated widely. Anti-slavery societies organized public lectures, and escaped slaves told their stories to audiences that were shocked by the brutality they described. For many in the North, the moral contradiction between America's ideals of liberty and the reality of human bondage became impossible to ignore. In the South, however, the reaction to abolitionism was fierce and defensive. Plantation elites, whose wealth and political power depended on the institution of slavery, argued that abolitionists threatened not only their economy but their way of life. They portrayed slavery as a benevolent system, claiming that enslaved people were cared for and civilized, a narrative designed to protect their interests and justify the continued exploitation of millions of human beings. Southern lawmakers passed increasingly repressive legislation to control enslaved populations and punish anyone suspected of assisting escape or spreading anti-slavery ideas. The more the abolitionist movement grew, the more entrenched Southern leaders became. This tension was further amplified by a stark social hierarchy within the Southern states themselves. Although only a minority of white Southerners owned plantations or large numbers of enslaved workers, the economic and political influence of this elite class was immense. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a relatively small group of powerful landowners who controlled local governments, dominated regional commerce, and shaped the South's political agenda. Most white Southerners were small farmers or laborers with modest means, yet many were staunch supporters of slavery. For them, the institution represented social stability and racial hierarchy, and assurance that regardless of their own poverty, they remained above the enslaved population. Thus, by the mid-19th century, the United States had become a nation divided, not simply by geography, but by worldview. In the North, slavery was increasingly seen as incompatible with the nation's ideals and future progress. In the South, it was defended as essential to prosperity and social order. The tension between these opposing visions grew with every passing decade, deepening the wound that had been inflicted centuries earlier by the arrival of enslaved Africans to American shores. What began as an economic system had transformed into the nation's most enduring moral crisis. The lines between freedom and bondage, justice and exploitation, unity and division became so sharply drawn that compromise was no longer possible. The legacy of slavery, born in the early days of colonial America, had set the stage for a conflict that would eventually tear the country apart, a tragic reckoning with the very principles on which the United States claimed to stand. As the United States expanded westward during the 19th century, the question of slavery's future in the newly acquired territories became the central political issue dividing the nation. Every new stretch of land from the Louisiana Purchase, 2 territories taken from Mexico, posed the same explosive question: would these new regions permit slavery, or would they be free? This debate quickly turned Congress into a battleground where political factions clashed with increasing bitterness. What was at stake was not merely governance of the territories, but the balance of political power between the free states of the North and the slaveholding states of the South. Neither side was willing to allow the other to dominate national policy, and every proposal regarding the West became a proxy war over the future of slavery itself. The first major attempt to address this growing tension came in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. When Missouri applied for statehood as a slave state, it threatened to upset the delicate balance in the Senate, where free and slave states were represented equally. After fierce debate, Congress reached a compromise. Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state, Maine would be admitted as a free state, and slavery would be prohibited north of the 3630 latitude line in the remaining Louisiana Territory. On the surface, this appeared to be a workable solution, one that preserved political equilibrium. In reality, however, it merely postponed the inevitable confrontation. The compromise rested on geographical boundaries rather than addressing the fundamental, moral, and political conflict over slavery. The uneasy balance, struck in 1820, held for several decades. But as American expansion accelerated, the cracks began to show. By the mid-1840s, the nation's territorial gains, especially after the Mexican-American War, forced Congress once again to confront the issue. The Compromise of 1850 emerged as another attempt to calm the storm. It admitted California as a free state, allowed the new territories of Utah and New Mexico to determine the slavery question by popular sovereignty, abolished the slave trade but not slavery itself in Washington, D.C., and introduced a harsh new Fugitive Slave Act that required citizens of all states to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. These measures, particularly the Fugitive Slave Act, ignited outrage in the North. Many Northerners who had been indifferent to the slavery question were now confronted with the reality that they could be compelled by law to help return enslaved people to bondage. The South, on the other hand, celebrated the act as a victory and a necessary defense of their property rights. Once again, compromise had done nothing but heighten tensions. Instead of unifying the nation, it underscored just how deeply divided it had become. The precarious political balance shattered further with the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, introduced by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. The act effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise by allowing the residents of Kansas and Nebraska to determine for themselves whether slavery would be permitted. Douglas believed this principle of popular sovereignty would solve the crisis by letting local settlers decide their own fate. Instead, it unleashed chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each attempting to control the territorial government. What followed was a period of violent conflict known as Bleeding Kansas, a grim preview of the nationwide bloodshed to come. Armed militias, fraudulent elections, raids, and retaliatory attacks turned Kansas into a war zone. Newspapers in both the North and South seized on the violence to condemn the opposing side, heightening sectional hatred. The federal government seemed unable or unwilling to stop the escalating conflict. Kansas became symbolic, not just of territorial dispute, but of a nation losing its ability to govern itself peacefully. Of this chaos emerged a new political force, the Republican Party, formed in the mid-1850s by a coalition of abolitionists, free soil, and disillusioned former Whigs. The Republican Party centered its platform on opposing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, while the party stopped short of calling for immediate abolition in the South. It argued that slavery should not be allowed to spread beyond where it already existed. This position directly challenged the South's ambitions to expand its plantation system westward, and Southern politicians viewed the party's rise as an existential threat. The Republicans' rapid growth demonstrated just how dramatically Northern political opinion had shifted since the Compromise of 1850. For many Northerners, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the violence it produced made compromise no longer acceptable. The political divide reached a new level of intensity with the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case of 1857. Dred Scott, an enslaved man, sued for his freedom on the grounds that he had lived for years in free territory. Instead of delivering a narrow ruling on Scott's legal status, the court issued a sweeping decision that stunned the nation. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney declared that African Americans enslaved or free could not be citizens of the United States and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. Moreover, the court ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories, effectively nullifying the Missouri Compromise and undermining the very idea of free soil. The ruling enraged the North. Newspapers denounced it as an attempt by the slave power to nationalize slavery. Many Northerners believed the decision proved that the federal government was under the control of Southern interests. In contrast, the South celebrated the ruling as validation of their constitutional arguments. The decision made compromise nearly impossible. It stripped Congress of the power to regulate slavery in the territories and left the question entirely in the hands of slaveholding interests. By the late 1850s, the political fabric of the United States was unraveling. Years of compromises, each one intended to hold the Union together, had instead revealed the depth of the divisions over slavery. Every attempt to bridge the gap between North and South only widened it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act turned the frontier into a battlefield. The rise of the Republican Party transformed the political landscape, and the Dred Scott decision convinced millions of Americans that peaceful solutions were slipping away. The stage was set for the crisis that would soon erupt into full-scale war. As the nation's political institutions proved unable to contain the moral and economic conflict that had been building for decades. The presidential election of 1860 marked one of the most consequential turning points in American history. For decades, the fragile balance between free and slave states had held the nation together, though barely. By the time the election approached, tensions were so severe that many Americans feared the Union would not survive the year. 4 major candidates competed for the presidency, each representing a different vision for the nation's future. But the outcome would hinge on a man who had never before held national office: Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate who opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Lincoln's victory was decisive in the Electoral College, but deeply sectional in character. He carried every free state in the North while receiving virtually no support in the South. Indeed, his name was not even on the ballot in many Southern states. When the final results were announced, Lincoln had won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. For many Southerners, this outcome was nothing less than an existential crisis. It signaled the rise of a political power that they believed threatened their economic system, their social order, and their way of life. Southern leaders interpreted Lincoln's election as the beginning of a federal campaign to abolish slavery entirely. Although Lincoln repeatedly stated that he did not intend to interfere with slavery where it already existed, his opposition to its expansion was enough to alarm a region that depended heavily on enslaved labor. Plantation owners and political elites argued that stopping the spread of slavery would eventually undermine the entire system. Without new territories to expand into, they believed slavery would be confined and ultimately strangled. Rumors spread rapidly across the South that the new Republican government would use its power to weaken the institution until it collapsed. Fear soon turned into fury. Southern newspapers warned that Lincoln's presidency represented a black Republican takeover aimed at destroying Southern society. Fire eaters, radical pro-secession politicians seized the moment to push for immediate action. They argued that the South must assert its rights and leave the Union before federal power could be used against them. These warnings found a receptive audience among many white Southerners, who felt increasingly alienated from the political system in Washington. The first major act of defiance came from South Carolina. On December 20, 1860, just weeks after Lincoln's election, a state convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. The announcement sent shockwaves throughout the country. South Carolina justified its decision by issuing a declaration of causes, which made it clear that slavery and states' rights were at the heart of its departure. The declaration accused northern states of hostility to the institution of slavery and argued that the federal government had failed to protect Southern interests. South Carolina's secession triggered a chain reaction. Within weeks, 6 more Southern states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas each issued its own declaration, and nearly all cited the defense of slavery as central to their decision. By February 1861, before Lincoln had even taken office, these 7 states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new government, the Confederate States of America. The formation of the Confederacy was swift and deliberate. Delegates drafted a constitution that closely resembled that of the United States, but explicitly protected slavery as a fundamental institution. The newly formed government elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as its president. Davis, though reluctant at first, accepted the role and began organizing a provisional government. The Confederacy set about creating a new nation, complete with its own Congress, currency, and military forces. Lincoln, still president-elect at the time, watched these events unfold with growing concern but limited power to act. Outgoing President James Buchanan insisted that secession was illegal but also believed the federal government lacked authority to stop it, a contradictory position that left the Union in a state of paralysis. As state after state withdrew from the Union, federal institutions in the South began to crumble. U.S. forts, arsenals, and customs houses were seized by Confederate forces, often without resistance. Only a few federal installations remained under Union control, most notably Fort Sumter, located in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The presence of a federal garrison on what the Confederacy now considered its own territory created an explosive situation. For the newly formed Confederate government, the fort stood as a symbol of Northern occupation. For Lincoln, it represented a test of federal authority and the legitimacy of the Union itself. As Lincoln prepared for his inauguration in March 1861, the fate of the nation hung in the balance. In his inaugural address, he appealed to reason and unity, declaring that he had no intention of ending slavery where it existed and pleading with the Southern states to return peacefully. Yet he also vowed to uphold the Constitution and to maintain federal property, including Fort Sumter. His message was clear: the Union was perpetual, and secession was unlawful. But the South was no longer willing to compromise. The Confederacy, convinced that coexistence with the Union was impossible, began mobilizing for war. Confederate forces surrounded Fort Sumter and demanded its surrender. Negotiations dragged on, but tension mounted with each passing day. The fort, low on supplies and increasingly isolated, became the focal point of a national crisis. By the early spring of 1861, the United States had reached the brink of conflict. The political disputes of the previous decades had escalated into a rupture that could no longer be contained. The election of Abraham Lincoln had exposed the depth of the nation's divisions, shattering the illusion that compromise could preserve unity. As the Confederacy solidified its identity and federal authority collapsed across the South, the Union faced a stark reality. The country was now split in two, and the possibility of war grew increasingly unavoidable. The road to secession, paved with decades of political discord and moral conflict, had reached its end. The next chapter would be written, not in congressional halls or convention chambers, but on the battlefield. By early 1861, the fragile balance between the Union and the newly formed Confederacy had all but evaporated. The epicenter of this growing crisis lay in Charleston Harbor, where Fort Sumter, one of the last remaining federal military installations in the seceded states, stood as a tangible reminder of Union authority. For both sides, the fort became a symbol too important to abandon. President Abraham Lincoln faced intense pressure to assert federal control, while Confederate leaders viewed the fort's presence as an intolerable violation of their sovereignty. The diplomatic and military tensions surrounding this strategic outpost would soon erupt into the opening conflict of the American Civil War. The standoff began long before Lincoln took office. Major Robert Anderson, commander of the small Union garrison at Fort Sumter, had quietly moved his men from the more vulnerable Fort Moultrie to the imposing island stronghold in December 1860. This move angered South Carolina officials, but was carried out to prevent bloodshed. Once the Confederacy was formed, Fort Sumter became the focal point of a growing dispute between the two governments. Supplies were running dangerously low, and Anderson's men faced starvation if relief did not arrive soon. When Lincoln assumed the presidency in March 1861, he inherited a crisis with no easy solution. He knew that abandoning the fort would signal weakness and possibly encourage further secession, but any attempt to reinforce it risked provoking a military confrontation. His cabinet was sharply divided, with some urging evacuation to avoid war and others insisting that surrender would be catastrophic for national authority. Lincoln weighed each option carefully, aware that his first major decision as president could shape the future of the Union. Meanwhile, Confederate President Jefferson Davis faced pressures of his own. Hardliners within his government demanded the removal of the Union garrison, arguing that a sovereign nation could not tolerate a foreign military presence within its borders. The newly formed Confederate Army, under the command of General P.G.T. Beauregard, surrounded the harbor and prepared for action. As negotiations stalled, both governments understood that time was running out. On April 6, Lincoln informed South Carolina's governor that he intended to send a relief expedition to Fort Sumter, but only provisions, not reinforcements or weapons. His message was a diplomatic attempt to avoid war while maintaining federal authority. Nonetheless, when news of the expedition reached the Confederacy, it was interpreted as an act of aggression. Jefferson Davis, convinced that delay would only weaken the Confederacy's position, made the fateful decision: the fort must be taken before the relief ships arrived. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate envoys delivered an ultimatum to Major Anderson demanding the fort's surrender. Anderson refused, unwilling to yield without resistance. At 4:30 a.m., Confederate batteries fired the first cannon shot at Fort Sumter. The thunderous blast echoed across Charleston Harbor, marking the start of the American Civil War. For 34 hours, Confederate artillery bombarded the fort from all sides, the sky lit with flashes of exploding shells. and dense smoke enveloped the stronghold as buildings caught fire. Despite the relentless assault, Anderson's troops returned fire, though their limited ammunition made resistance largely symbolic. Miraculously, there were no combat fatalities during the bombardment, but the fort suffered severe structural damage. On April 13, realizing that further resistance was futile and that his men were at risk of being buried under collapsing masonry, Anderson agreed to surrender. He and his troops were permitted to evacuate with dignity. Carrying their tattered flag, a symbol that would soon become a rallying cry across the North, news of the attack spread rapidly, igniting a firestorm of patriotism throughout the country. In the North, the bombardment of Fort Sumter galvanized public opinion in a way that no political speech or legislative debate ever could. Previously divided communities united behind the Union cause. Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Thousands rushed to enlist, filling city squares and rural towns with men ready to take up arms. The streets of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston erupted with patriotic fervor. Flags flew from windows, newspapers urged immediate action, and young men formed volunteer regiments overnight. In the South, the effect was equally dramatic. The firing on Fort Sumter was seen not merely as a military victory but as the birth of a new nation, willing to defend its sovereignty. Crowds celebrated in Charleston and throughout the Confederacy. Southern governors pledged troops to defend their fledgling republic. The attack also triggered the secession of 4 additional states: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, which joined the Confederacy after refusing to provide troops to Lincoln's call for volunteers. The Confederacy nearly doubled in size, gaining vital strategic resources and experienced military leaders. At the same time, both sides dramatically underestimated the scale of the conflict that lay ahead. In the euphoric days following Fort Sumter, many Americans believed the war would be short and decisive. Northern newspapers predicted a swift victory, confident in the Union's larger population and industrial might. Southern leaders, buoyed by a sense of honor and belief in their military tradition, insisted that the North lacked the resolve to wage a prolonged war. Politicians and civilians alike claimed conflict would be over in a matter of weeks. These predictions would soon prove tragically wrong. The enthusiasm that filled recruitment camps could not mask the realities of the war that was taking shape, a war driven by deep ideological divides and fought with increasingly modern weapons. The attack on Fort Sumter had not merely begun a rebellion, it had ignited a national catastrophe that neither side fully comprehended. As the smoke cleared over Charleston Harbor, the United States entered the most devastating conflict in its history. The first shot at Fort Sumter signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of a brutal struggle that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. The war that many thought would end quickly was just beginning, and the nation was headed into years of destruction, sacrifice, and transformation. When the Civil War began in April 1861, many in the North expected a quick victory, confident in their superior manpower and industry. Union leaders believed that one decisive battle would restore the nation. That illusion shattered on July 21, 1861. At the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as the Confederacy called it, the first major land engagement of the war, Union troops under Brigadier General Irvin McDowell marched toward the Confederate capital at Richmond, hoping to end the rebellion swiftly. Instead, they were met by determined Confederate forces who fought tenaciously along the banks of Bull Run Creek in Virginia. What began as a confident advance turned into chaos. Although Union forces initially gained ground, Confederate reinforcements arrived by train, a first in military history, and turned the tide. Brigadier General Thomas J. Jackson earned the nickname Stonewall for holding his brigade firm against Union assaults. As Confederate counterattacks surged, inexperienced Union soldiers panicked. The retreat soon became a rout, with soldiers and civilians alike fleeing back to Washington. The shocking defeat shattered the belief that the war would be brief or bloodless. The nation realized that a long and brutal struggle lay ahead. In the aftermath of Bull Run, the Union Army underwent significant reorganization. President Lincoln replaced McDowell with Major General George B. McClellan, a young officer with a reputation for discipline and administrative skill. McClellan transformed the disorganized Union troops defending Washington into the Army of the Potomac, a formidable, well-trained fighting force. Soldiers admired him for his attention to their welfare, and the public saw him as a potential savior of the Union cause. But McClellan also had flaws. He was overly cautious, exaggerated enemy strength, and often delayed action habits that would frustrate Lincoln and the Northern government as the war progressed. While the Union rebuilt its forces, the Confederacy strengthened its own command structure. Soon, the South would find its most celebrated military leader, General Robert E. Lee, initially serving as an advisor to Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Lee's rise to command came during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. This ambitious Union offensive aimed to capture Richmond by advancing up the Virginia Peninsula. McClellan transported more than 100,000 soldiers by water to the Regina, logistical feat unmatched at the time and began marching toward the Confederate capital. At first, the plan seemed promising, but McClellan's caution paralyzed the campaign. Overestimating Confederate numbers, he hesitated repeatedly, allowing the enemy time to fortify their defenses. When Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston was wounded in battle, Davis appointed Robert E. Lee to command the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee quickly demonstrated boldness and tactical brilliance. In a series of engagements known as the 7 Days Battles, Lee repeatedly attacked McClellan, forcing him into retreat despite suffering heavy casualties. The Peninsula Campaign ended in failure for the Union and elevated Lee's reputation as the Confederacy's most skilled commander. Lincoln, frustrated by McClellan's unwillingness to strike decisively, brought in new Union generals to challenge Lee in Northern Virginia. General John Pope took command of the Army of Virginia, but Lee swiftly defeated him at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862. This victory emboldened the Confederacy and opened the door for Lee's first invasion of the North. By taking the war into Union territory, Lee hoped to secure foreign recognition for the Confederacy, weaken Northern morale, and possibly influence upcoming midterm elections. Lee crossed into Maryland in early September, but his bold campaign soon encountered unexpected obstacles. A copy of his battle plan's Special Order 191 was discovered by Union soldiers wrapped around cigars. McClellan finally had the advantage he had long sought. With newfound urgency, he moved to engage Lee's divided forces near the town of Maryland. What followed on September 17, 1862, was the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history. In the early morning, Union forces under General Joseph Hooker struck the Confederate left flank in Miller's cornfield, where soldiers battled at point-blank range amid tall stalks torn apart by gunfire. The fighting shifted to the Sunken Road, later known as Bloody Lane, where Confederate defenders inflicted massive casualties before being overwhelmed. Further south, a desperate struggle unfolded at Burnside Bridge, where repeated Union assaults met fierce resistance from a small Confederate force positioned on high ground. The carnage was unimaginable. By sunset, over 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Although the battle ended inconclusively on the field, Lee's army was forced to withdraw back into Virginia, giving the Union a strategic if not decisive victory. McClellan, however, failed to pursue Lee aggressively, squandering an opportunity to potentially destroy the Confederate army. Lincoln, increasingly frustrated with McClellan's reluctance, would soon relieve him of command. Yet Antietam's impact extended far beyond military strategy. Politically, it provided Lincoln with the critical opportunity he needed. For months, he had drafted a proclamation to transform the war from a fight to preserve the Union into a struggle for human freedom. But he waited for a Union victory to announce it. Antietam gave him that moment. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory would be freed on January 1, 1863. The proclamation redefined the war's purpose. It prevented European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing the Confederacy. Since they could not support a nation fighting to preserve slavery, it also opened the door for African American men to join the Union Army, adding vital manpower to the war effort. Though limited in immediate effect, the proclamation marked a moral turning point, making abolition a central objective of the Union cause. From Bull Run to end, the war on the Eastern Front revealed the harsh realities of modern warfare: indecision, innovation, heroism, and staggering loss. The Union had suffered setbacks and squandered opportunities, but Antietam offered a glimmer of hope and a reimagined purpose on a battlefield soaked with blood. The Battle of Antietam in September 1862 gave Abraham Lincoln the political opportunity he had been waiting for. For months, he had carried in his desk drawer a document that would transform not only the Civil War, but the very meaning of the United States. The conflict had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union. Lincoln's foremost objective was preventing the nation from fracturing into two competing republics. Yet, as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, it became increasingly clear that the institution of slavery lay at the heart of the conflict. To strike at slavery was to strike at the Confederacy's economic, social, and political foundation. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in the Confederate States shall be then and forever free. While it did not abolish slavery, nationwide it applied only to territories in rebellion, not loyal border states. The proclamation was revolutionary in its moral force. The United States government, for the first time, openly aligned itself with abolition. The war was no longer simply about restoring the Union. It had become a war of liberation. The proclamation fundamentally reshaped the moral landscape of the conflict. Before its issuance, many Northerners, especially Democrats, had been ambivalent about slavery or did not consider it a federal matter. By redefining the purpose of the war, Lincoln forced the country to confront the contradiction between America's founding ideals and the existence of human bondage. Union soldiers now marched not only to defend the nation but to destroy an institution that had oppressed millions. The Confederacy, meanwhile, interpreted the proclamation as evidence of the North's intent to dismantle Southern society completely. The stakes of the war were now unmistakable and irrevocable. For enslaved people in the South, the proclamation was a beacon of hope, though its legal enforcement depended on Union military victories. News of the proclamation spread rapidly through plantations and towns across the Confederacy. Enslaved men and women risked their lives to escape bondage, often fleeing under cover of night or slipping away during the chaos of battle. Thousands embarked on perilous journeys toward Union lines, where they sought freedom, protection, and the chance to contribute to the destruction of slavery. Some slipped past patrols, others walked for days without food. Still others were aided by Union soldiers or clandestine networks of abolitionists. The movement of enslaved people toward Union territory became known as the self-emancipation of African Americans. As Union armies advanced into the Confederacy, they were often followed by streams of refugees, men, women, and children fleeing slavery with little more than the clothes they wore. Many Union officers were initially unprepared to handle the influx, but the federal government soon established contraband camps, where formerly enslaved people received food, clothing, and education. Life in the camps was difficult, but for many who had never known freedom, they represented the first step toward a new life. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to fight for their own liberation. Lincoln authorized the recruitment of black soldiers into the Union Army, transforming the war effort. At first, there was resistance. Some Northern whites doubted the ability or loyalty of black soldiers, but the determination of African American volunteers quickly silenced such doubts. By war's end, nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had served in the Union forces, including the famed 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, whose bravery in the assault on Fort Wagner became legendary. Black soldiers played a crucial role in Union victories. They fought in major campaigns, guarded supply lines, and contributed to the collapse of the Confederacy's labor system by encouraging further escapes. Their service undermined centuries of racist ideology in both North and South, proving that African Americans were willing and fully able to fight and die for freedom. Their participation added essential manpower to the Union Army at a time when the war's demands were stretching the North's resources thin. The Emancipation Proclamation also had profound international consequences. Prior to 1863, both Great Britain and France, major world powers with strong economic ties to the South, had considered recognizing the Confederacy. Southern leaders believed that European dependence on cotton would force intervention on their behalf. But once Lincoln reframed the war as a struggle against slavery, foreign nations found it politically and morally difficult to support the Confederacy. Britain, having abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, could not publicly align itself with a slaveholding nation. France too hesitated, wary of global condemnation and internal political pressures. With one stroke of Lincoln's pen, the Confederacy's hopes for foreign recognition evaporated. The proclamation transformed the diplomatic landscape, isolating the South and strengthening the Union's global standing. European governments now viewed the Union cause as aligned with the broader movement toward human rights and abolition, an alignment that the Confederacy could not counter. Despite its sweeping impact, the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery overnight. Its power depended on the advance of Union armies. As Northern troops marched deeper into Confederate territory, they carried freedom with them. Plantations collapsed, slave patrols disintegrated, and enslaved people seized control of their futures. Each Union victory extended the reach of the proclamation. Each Confederate defeat brought thousands more out of bondage. Lincoln understood that the proclamation was only the beginning. He pursued a constitutional amendment, the eventual 13th Amendment, to abolish slavery throughout the United States permanently. Yet even before its passage, the Emancipation Proclamation irrevocably changed the nature of the Civil War and the meaning of American freedom by turning a war for union into a war for liberation. Lincoln altered history. The proclamation struck a powerful moral blow against slavery, inspired the self-emancipation of thousands, reshaped the Union Army, and closed the door on international support for the Confederacy. It marked a profound shift in America's national identity, injecting the war with a purpose that transcended territorial integrity. From that moment forward, victory meant not only the reunification of the nation, but the destruction of slavery itself. The American Civil War is often remembered for its staggering human cost, but it was also a pivotal moment in military history, a conflict in which industrial power became as decisive as bravery on the battlefield. By 1861, the North had already established itself as an industrial powerhouse. Its cities were filled with factories producing textiles, iron, and a growing arsenal of weaponry. The Union's ability to harness industrial output became a critical advantage in a war that would stretch the nation to its limits. Northern factories turned out weapons, ammunition, and uniforms at a scale previously unseen in America. Springfield and Harper's Ferry produced rifled muskets and artillery that allowed Union soldiers to fire farther and more accurately than ever before. The Union Navy commissioned new ships in large numbers, many powered by steam, giving them unprecedented mobility along rivers and coastlines. Industrial capacity also extended to the mass production of shoes, tents, and medical supplies, whereas previous American wars had relied on ad hoc supply chains and locally procured materials. The Union Army could now mobilize and sustain vast armies over long distances, transforming logistics into a weapon of war. The Union's railroads amplified this advantage. Rail lines connected cities, ports, and supply depots, allowing for rapid troop movements and resupply. General George B. McClellan, for example, relied heavily on railroads during the Peninsula Campaign to move tens of thousands of soldiers from Washington, D.C., to Virginia. Rail lines enabled reinforcements to arrive quickly at critical points, and damaged tracks could often be repaired faster than Confederate forces could destroy them. This mobility not only allowed for operational flexibility but also made Union campaigns more resilient in the face of unexpected setbacks. The Confederacy, in contrast, faced severe industrial and logistical limitations. Southern states had far fewer factories and produced only a fraction of the weapons, ammunition, and uniforms that the North could supply, while the South possessed abundant raw materials such as cotton and iron ore. Converting these resources into usable military goods proved difficult. Railroads existed but were fewer in number, narrower in gauge, and less interconnected than those in the North. These shortcomings severely limited the ability of Confederate armies to reinforce or resupply quickly, a problem that would plague their campaigns throughout the war. The industrial disparity shaped not only the scale of the war, but also the tactics employed. Rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and artillery transformed battlefields into arenas where massed formations of soldiers suffered devastating losses. Siege operations, such as those at Yorktown and later Petersburg, illustrated the growing importance of entrenchments and artillery. Precursors to the trench warfare of the 20th century, logistics now became central to strategy. An army without ammunition, food, or medical supplies could not fight, regardless of courage or leadership. Naval warfare, too, was transformed by industry. The clash between the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia, formerly Merrimack, in March 1862 signaled the dawn of the ironclad era. Traditional wooden ships, vulnerable to artillery and fire, were suddenly obsolete against armored steam-powered vessels. The Monitor's revolving turret introduced a new concept in naval design, while the Virginia demonstrated the threat of armored rams and artillery platforms. Although the battle ended inconclusively, the encounter revolutionized naval strategy worldwide, forcing navies to reconsider shipbuilding, armor, and artillery. Industrialization also reshaped supply chains on land. Union forces relied on vast networks of depots, wagon trains, and river transport to maintain frontline armies. The ability to stockpile food, ammunition, and medical supplies allowed generals to undertake prolonged campaigns far from home. The siege of Vicksburg, for instance, depended on Union control of rail and river networks to keep Grant's forces fed while cutting off Confederate supplies. Without industrial infrastructure, sustained operations of this scale would have been impossible. Confederate forces attempted to compensate with ingenuity and improvisation. Southern leaders developed domestic weapons when imports were cut off by the Union blockade, and local militias sometimes produced small arms and ammunition. However, the disparity in scale was stark. Northern rail lines could replace losses and maintain supply far more efficiently than the Confederacy, giving Union commanders strategic flexibility and operational endurance. The South's reliance on local resources and limited manufacturing capacity increasingly constrained its military options, forcing defensive campaigns and reactive maneuvers rather than sustained offensives. The industrial nature of the war also increased its destructiveness. Mass-produced rifles and artillery made frontal assaults deadly, while entrenched positions multiplied casualties. Cities and infrastructure became targets. The Union's ability to transport troops and supplies made rail lines, bridges, and depots strategic objectives, and Confederate forces often destroyed their own infrastructure to slow Northern advances. The war was no longer purely about battlefield valor. Industrial strength and logistical management determined who could endure the conflict. By 1863, it was clear that industrial power was as decisive as battlefield strategy. The North's ability to equip, feed, and move armies on a continental scale enabled campaigns deep into Confederate territory. The South's industrial and logistical weaknesses, conversely, made prolonged resistance increasingly difficult. From the ironclads on the seas to the railroads crisscrossing Virginia, industry had become inseparable from warfare. Commanders who ignored logistics risked disaster. Those who mastered it could shape the outcome of campaigns. In the Civil War, the integration of industrial capacity, modern weaponry, and transportation networks marked a turning point in military history. The war was no longer fought solely with courage and manpower, but with factories, iron, and steam. Northern advantages in these areas gave the Union the strategic upper hand, while Confederate limitations foreshadowed the challenges that would ultimately contribute to their defeat. Logistics, weapons, and industrial might were not mere tools, they were instruments of victory, reshaping the conduct of war forever. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had entered a critical phase. After 2 years of grueling fighting, neither the Union nor the Confederacy had achieved a decisive victory. But the momentum of the conflict was beginning to shift. Two monumental events, the Battle of Gettysburg and the fall of Vicksburg, would become turning points, reshaping the trajectory of the war and redefining the strategies of both sides. General Robert E. Lee, buoyed by previous Confederate victories in Virginia, launched an audacious invasion of the North in June 1863. Lee believed that a decisive victory on Union soil could demoralize Northern citizens, encourage foreign recognition of the Confederacy, and perhaps force the Union government to negotiate peace. His Army of Northern Virginia moved through the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania, aiming to strike at the heart of the Union. Lee's offensive represented not just a tactical gamble but a strategic risk. If he failed, the Confederacy could suffer irreparable losses in men and morale. The armies collided at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, from July 1 to July 3, 1863. It was the largest battle ever fought on American soil, involving over 160,000 soldiers and producing unprecedented casualties. The first 2 days of fighting saw heavy clashes at locations such as Little Round Top, Cemetery Hill, and the Wheatfield, with both sides incurring brutal losses. Lee pressed the attack relentlessly, confident that his forces could break the Union lines. On the third day, however, the infamous Pickett's Charge assault against fortified Union positions on Cemetery Ridge ended in disaster. Thousands of Confederate soldiers were cut down by concentrated artillery and rifle fire, marking the collapse of Lee's offensive. The Union victory at Gettysburg was monumental in both symbolic and strategic terms. It halted the Confederate advance into the North, preserved Union territory, and provided a surge of morale for Northern civilians and troops alike. Lee's defeat forced him to retreat to Virginia, and the Confederacy would never again mount a comparable invasion of Northern soil. Politically, Gettysburg strengthened Lincoln's position in the North, reinforcing public support for the war effort at a time when fatigue and casualty lists had begun to erode patience. While the Battle of Gettysburg dominated headlines in the East, Vicksburg, Mississippi, represented an equally critical turning point in the Western theater. For months, Union forces under General Ulysses S. Grant had laid siege to this strategically vital city on the Mississippi River. Control of Vicksburg would give the Union complete command of the river, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and severing supply lines between Eastern and Western Confederate states. Grant's campaign was methodical. He cut off reinforcements, used the terrain to isolate Confederate defenders, and maintained pressure through continuous bombardment and encirclement. On July 4, 1863, after 6 weeks of siege, Confederate General John C. Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg to Grant. The victory was decisive. The Union gained control of the Mississippi River, achieving a major objective of the Anaconda Plan and crippling the Confederate war effort. With the river in Union hands, supplies, troops, and communication between Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were effectively cut off from the Eastern Confederacy, leaving Southern states divided and vulnerable. The simultaneous Union successes at Gettysburg and Vicksburg created a profound shift in the war's momentum. For the North, these victories reinforced the perception that the Confederacy could be defeated, boosting morale and lending credence to Lincoln's vision of a restored Union. Soldiers were inspired by tangible results, and civilian confidence in the government's ability to prosecute the war increased. Grant's success in the West demonstrated the importance of coordinated, strategic campaigns, while the Union victory at Gettysburg proved that the Army of the Potomac could withstand and repel Lee's seasoned forces. For the Confederacy, the twin setbacks were devastating. Lee's failed invasion exposed the limitations of Confederate forces in offensive operations, highlighting the risks of overextending supply lines and underestimating Union defenses. Meanwhile, the loss of Vicksburg severed critical communication and logistical networks, isolating parts of the Confederacy from each other and reducing their strategic flexibility. Southern leaders faced mounting pressure to defend their territory rather than pursue ambitious offensives, signaling a shift from expansion to survival. The psychological impact of these events was equally profound. In the South, morale declined as the war's reality the Union's superior resources and coordination became undeniable. In the North, conversely, the twin victories were celebrated as signs of progress, even as casualties remained heavy. Newspapers across Union states hailed Gettysburg and Vicksburg as defining moments, framing the war as moving inexorably toward Union victory. Politically, the victories strengthened Lincoln's hand, giving him the credibility to pursue broader wartime policies, including the Emancipation Proclamation's enforcement and future military strategies. Strategically, both victories reshaped military thinking. Gettysburg emphasized the risks of direct assault against well-fortified positions, teaching commanders the importance of reconnaissance, entrenchment, and coordinated maneuvers. Vicksburg illustrated the power of siege warfare, logistics, and strategic control of transportation networks. Union leaders increasingly recognized the necessity of leveraging industrial and geographic advantages to weaken the Confederacy rather than relying solely on battlefield heroics. In retrospect, Gettysburg and Vicksburg marked the high-water mark of the Confederacy. After these events, Confederate forces would increasingly be forced onto the defensive, while Union armies gained confidence in their ability to sustain prolonged campaigns. The dual victories demonstrated that strategic coordination across multiple theaters could yield decisive results, setting the stage for the final Union offensives in 1864 to 1865. Ultimately, these turning points illustrate how the Civil War was not simply a contest of armies but a conflict shaped by leadership, logistics, geography, and timing. Gettysburg and Vicksburg combined tactical brilliance, operational planning, and strategic foresight, producing outcomes that would resonate throughout the remaining years of the war. From the blood-soaked fields of Pennsylvania to the fortified hills of Mississippi, the Civil War had reached a moment of transformation, one that would bring the Union closer to ultimate victory and push the Confederacy into a desperate fight for survival. By 1864, the Civil War had reached a stage where conventional battles alone could no longer guarantee a decisive outcome. The Union's leadership understood that defeating the Confederacy required not just battlefield victories but the systematic destruction of its capacity to wage war. The appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as commander of all Union armies marked a critical turning point, signaling a new phase of relentless strategy and total war. Grant's command emphasized coordinated assaults across multiple fronts. While he engaged Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the Overland Campaign, he applied constant pressure to keep Confederate forces on the defensive. The campaign included a series of brutal battles wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, demonstrating the deadly efficiency of entrenched positions and the enormous human cost of modern warfare. The Siege of Petersburg highlighted the evolution of combat into a war of attrition. Extensive trench networks, fortified artillery positions, and protracted engagements foreshadowed the type of warfare that would dominate the First World War decades later. The goal was clear: to exhaust the Confederacy's manpower, morale, and resources, forcing it toward surrender. While Grant maintained pressure in Virginia, General William Tecumseh Sherman carried the Union strategy of total war into the Deep South. Sherman understood that defeating Confederate armies alone would not be sufficient. The South's economy, infrastructure, and civilian morale also had to be targeted. Following the fall of Atlanta in September 1864, a major industrial and railroad hub, Sherman embarked on his famous March to the Sea. His campaign stretched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, a distance of nearly 300 miles, and involved the deliberate destruction of railroads, bridges, crops, livestock, and supply depots. By crippling the South's logistical networks, Sherman ensured that Confederate armies could not resupply or maneuver effectively. Sherman's march was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological weapon. Southern civilians, long supporters of the Confederacy, witnessed the tangible destruction of their communities. Towns were burned, plantations dismantled, and rail lines torn apart. The Union Army left a trail of devastation that undermined civilian morale and the will to resist. While controversial at the time, the campaign demonstrated a stark principle. In modern warfare, civilian infrastructure and morale could no longer be separated from military objectives. Sherman's strategy hastened the collapse of the Confederacy by making resistance increasingly futile. The effectiveness of total war was reinforced by the simultaneous collapse of Confederate defensive positions. Grant's forces gradually tightened the noose around Petersburg and Richmond. The prolonged siege drained Confederate supplies, while constant bombardment and entrenched Union positions prevented effective counterattacks. Confederate soldiers faced starvation, exhaustion, and dwindling ammunition, and morale plummeted as it became evident that relief forces would not arrive. The fall of Atlanta and the eventual evacuation of Richmond signaled that the Confederacy's capacity to sustain the war had reached its breaking point. Sherman's and Grant's coordinated campaigns demonstrated the interconnection between strategy, logistics, and morale in the total war concept. By striking simultaneously in multiple theaters, the Union forced Confederate forces to stretch beyond their limits, unable to defend all fronts effectively. The destruction of Southern infrastructure made retreat and regrouping increasingly impossible, while the Union's industrial and logistical superiority ensured that its armies could maintain momentum without succumbing to supply shortages. The war had evolved from isolated battles into a comprehensive effort to dismantle the Confederacy systematically. The culmination of these campaigns came in the spring of 1865. Lee, recognizing the untenable position of his forces, attempted to retreat westward in search of supplies and reinforcements. However, Grant's relentless pursuit allowed Union forces to intercept and corner the Army of Northern Virginia. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively bringing major hostilities in the Eastern Theater to an end. This surrender marked the symbolic and practical collapse of the Confederacy, confirming that the combination of strategic pressure, total war, and industrial advantage had succeeded where earlier battlefield victories had failed to achieve decisive results. The impact of Sherman's march and Grant's campaigns extended beyond the immediate military sphere. Total war reshaped Southern society, devastating its economy and infrastructure. Plantations were destroyed, towns burned, and the civilian population faced shortages of food, clothing, and shelter. These campaigns illustrated a sobering reality. Modern warfare could no longer be confined to professional soldiers on designated battlefields. The line between combatant and civilian had blurred, and the consequences of war reached deep into society. In this sense, the Civil War became a precursor to the industrialized conflicts of the 20th century, where logistics, morale, and civilian infrastructure were integral to military strategy. Moreover, the Union victories reinforced the political objectives of the war by demonstrating the inevitability of Confederate defeat. Grant and Sherman strengthened Lincoln's position and solidified public support for policies such as the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. The collapse of the Confederacy opened the path for Reconstruction. Although the challenges of rebuilding the South and integrating freed slaves into society would persist for generations, militarily and politically, the campaigns of 1864 to 1865 illustrated the synergy between battlefield success and the broader goals of national unification and social transformation. In conclusion, Sherman's march and the total war strategy epitomized the evolution of the Civil War into a modern conflict. The Union's ability to coordinate multiple theaters, exploit industrial superiority, and target both military and civilian infrastructure demonstrated a new paradigm in warfare. The fall of Atlanta, the devastation of Georgia, the siege of Petersburg, and the surrender at Appomattox collectively ensured the Confederacy's collapse. By combining relentless pressure, strategic foresight, and total war, Grant and Sherman brought an end to the major fighting and reshaped the Southern landscape politically, economically, and socially, signaling the dawn of a new chapter in American history. By the spring of 1865, the echoes of cannon fire that had defined for years of Civil War gradually faded across the American landscape. The surrender of General Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse marked not merely the collapse of the Confederate military but the formal end of a conflict that had torn the nation apart. In the aftermath of the war, the United States faced a daunting task: reconstructing a fractured nation while attempting to reconcile the enduring consequences of centuries of slavery. The end of the war brought a profound legal and moral shift. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, constitutionally abolished slavery throughout the United States for millions of African Americans who had been enslaved. This legal transformation represented the culmination of generations of suffering and resistance. The amendment did not instantly resolve the deep social inequalities, but it established a foundation for freedom and citizenship that had been denied to an entire population for centuries. Emancipation, once a promise confined to battlefields and proclamations, now became a permanent, enforceable principle. Despite this legal triumph, the Reconstruction era presented immense challenges. The South lay in ruins, its cities and towns devastated, its economy crippled, and its social fabric in disarray. Formerly enslaved individuals faced the daunting task of integrating into a society that had long denied them basic rights and dignity. Many sought land, employment, and education, yet the structures for achieving equality were fragile and contested. Federal authorities, Northern philanthropists, and newly freed African Americans worked to establish schools, build civic institutions, and participate in political life, often amid violent opposition from entrenched white elites. The promise of Reconstruction was tempered by persistent racial conflict. White supremacist groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, used terror and intimidation to undermine African American progress and maintain control over Southern society. Segregationist practices began to solidify, laying the groundwork for the Jim Crow laws that would dominate the South for decades. Although the legal abolition of slavery was absolute, the struggle for genuine social, political, and economic equality had only just begun. The nation confronted the stark reality that ending slavery did not automatically erase the deep-seated prejudices and power structures that had supported it. That the war's conclusion also reshaped the American national identity. The survival of the Union affirmed the principle that the United States was indivisible, and that federal authority could supersede state claims to secession. The conflict tested the durability of democratic institutions under the strain of existential crises, revealing both vulnerabilities and strengths. The sacrifices of soldiers and civilians alike reinforced a sense of shared purpose, even amid profound regional divisions, and laid the groundwork for a national identity that increasingly embraced unity over sectional loyalty. Militarily, the Civil War left an enduring legacy. It demonstrated the transformative impact of industrialization and modern warfare, as seen in the use of railroads, telegraphs, rifled artillery, ironclad ships, and total war campaigns. The conflict also emphasized the importance of professional leadership, strategic coordination, and logistical planning in achieving decisive results. Future American military doctrine would draw lessons from these innovations, understanding that success required not only battlefield heroics but also the capacity to sustain long-term, multifaceted operations. Socially and politically, the war's aftermath highlighted the centrality of civil rights and citizenship in the American experiment. The emancipation of millions of African Americans created a new class of citizens whose rights would be fiercely contested for generations. Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, laid the constitutional groundwork for civil rights, even as their implementation faced resistance and rollback. The struggle to reconcile the promise of freedom with entrenched inequalities became a defining challenge of post-war America, one whose echoes resonate to this day. The economic consequences of the war were equally profound. The Southern economy, long dependent on slave labor, was forced to adapt to a new reality of free labor and disrupted agricultural production. Northern industrial expansion, accelerated by wartime mobilization, further widened the economic divide between regions. Freed people sought participation in this economy, often under exploitative conditions, but their presence fundamentally altered labor relations and social hierarchies. Reconstruction policies attempted to rebuild infrastructure, promote education, and integrate freed people into economic life. Yet success was uneven and often contested by local elites. Ultimately, the Civil War and the abolition of slavery left an indelible mark on the American conscience. The nation emerged from the conflict with a clearer sense of its moral and legal obligations, yet also with the sobering recognition that justice and equality required constant vigilance. The tragedy of slavery, the devastation of war, and the complexities of Reconstruction combined to shape a modern America defined by both resilience and unresolved tension. The legacy of the war endures in multiple dimensions: the affirmation of federal authority and national unity, the codification of civil rights, the evolution of military strategy and technology, and the ongoing struggle to confront racial injustice. Americans were compelled to reckon with the stark reality that the principles of liberty and equality could not coexist with human bondage. The abolition of slavery was not an endpoint, but a beginning, a challenge to fulfill the nation's promise in practice, not merely in law. In reflection, the story of the Civil War underscores how the tragedy of slavery shaped the United States into a nation capable of profound transformation. The conflict destroyed old institutions, forced moral and legal reckonings, and laid the foundation for a reimagined democratic society. Its lessons about the costs of injustice, the complexities of freedom, and the enduring struggle for equality remain woven into the fabric of American life. The cannons may have fallen silent, but the reverberations of this defining struggle continue to echo across generations, shaping the identity, values, and aspirations of a nation still grappling with the legacy of its past.